In 1964, at the dawn of the Cold War, the Americans carried out one of their most ambitious projects, a technology typical of science fiction. The engineers of the U.S. Air Force dreamed of a supersonic bomber, capable of taking advantage of the most modern fighters of its time, and even those of the future. This plane, created through cutting-edge design, could travel from Washington to Moscow in a matter of minutes, to devastate the Kremlin with a powerful bombardment. We are talking about the XB-70 Valkyrie, a deep-penetration bomber prototype created by the Strategic Air Command of the U.S. Air Force. Thanks to a precise design, which allowed the B-70 to use the supersonic waves generated by its four engines to accelerate to a speed of 3,310 km per hour, and a flight ceiling of 21,000 meters, this aircraft promised to be an asset that would keep the Soviet Union at bay. But, due to a cruel twist of fate, the tremendous efforts made to see the light of this futuristic aircraft ended in a huge tragedy, and, to this day, there is only one Valkyrie left standing, which is nothing more than a museum piece exhibited in the United States. Join us in a new episode to learn about the disaster behind the dream of the American bomber. The history of the development of one of the most iconic projects in the history of the United States Air Force began in 1954, shortly after the end of World War II. After the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American engineers began to imagine what kind of aircraft could deploy these brutal weapons of mass destruction. The goal was extremely ambitious. They wanted a ground attack aircraft capable of flying at supersonic speeds, and that could reach a flight ceiling that would make it undetectable to ground defenses, as well as operate with a range of 12,000 kilometers without the need for refueling in flight. Of course, with our current technology, this doesn't sound like much, but 70 years ago, all these features combined in one vehicle were nothing more than a scientist's fever dream. In any case, the Boeing company, together with the Rand Corporation, decided to investigate the possibility of powering aircraft with nuclear energy. Although these experiments were considered a disaster, the U.S. Air Force decided to keep some desired aspects of the bomber, such as its ability to have long operating ranges, the highest possible speed, and a payload of 23,000 kilograms in its bomb bay. In 1957, the North American Aviation Company won the competition to be the developer of the USAF's Dream bomber. The work began immediately, as both the military and the engineers knew that, on the other side of the world, the Kremlin was trying to develop its own futuristic weapons. The arms race had begun, and not a second could be wasted. The idea of using nuclear energy, with the enormous heat generated by aircraft engines at high speeds, became unfeasible, but this did not frustrate the wishes of the U.S. military. The decision to solve this problem was to use 6 General Electric YJ-93 GE3 turbojet engines with afterburners, which would be fed by a 140,000 kilograms fuel tank. This allowed, in preliminary tests, the power plant to generate enough power to cross the Mach 3 barrier, that is, more than 3,000 kilometers per hour. This is about 3 times the speed of current commercial aircraft, which can reach around 900 kilometers per hour. A bomber with this speed would even outperform today's fastest fighter, the F-22 Raptor, which has a 2,400 kilometers per hour limit. The morphological design of the Valkyrie was also based on futuristic ideas, typical of the space race. We are talking about a real beast. The vehicle had a length of 56.3 meters, a wingspan of 32 meters and a height of 9.14 meters. Its wing area was 585 square meters, one of the largest in North American history. Empty, this monster weighed 115,000 kilograms. But prepared to fly, together with the 140 tons of minimum fuel and 25 tons of bombs, it could weigh more than 260,000 kilograms. This is equivalent to the weight of a loaded commercial aircraft, but capable of 3 times its maximum speed, something really extreme, even these days. The delta wing design was standardized around this time, so the Valkyrie took the shape of a large arrow, a design that would only be seen again with another supersonic aircraft that also ended in disgrace, the Concorde. This responded to the need to reduce the friction of the air on the fuselage, in addition to the fact that the pointed nose has a physical function, since this allows the generation of a shock wave, that is, it makes the aircraft break the air resistance so that it overcomes the sound barrier. Another of the bold decisions taken to take advantage of the shock wave was the design of the wings, whose tips could be folded or even detached from the body of the Valkyrie. This made the airship, so to speak, ride the waves it generated itself, giving it a huge acceleration to reach the speed of sound. To understand this idea in an easy way, we could say that the plane generated a strong suction in the lower part of its fuselage, which it used to propel itself and thus surf the air currents as if they were waves. Both the cabin and the interior of the plane were hermetically sealed and fully pressurized. The human body is not prepared to withstand the great pressures generated by shock waves, so the design had to be done as if it were a space rocket or a submarine, to preserve the integrity of the pilots. As for its armament, as we mentioned before, the Valkyrie would use a bottom-loading bay to drop free-fall bombs, especially nuclear type. Its maximum payload was never entirely clear, but it is estimated that the engineers managed to exceed the 23,000 kilograms demanded by the Air Force. By 1961, 2 XB-70 prototypes had been built, costing about $800 million at the time to develop and manufacture, equivalent to $7.3 billion today. But the dream of the American bombing would not last much longer. That same year, the U.S. Congress was shaken by an event known as the Missile Gap. Starting in 1957, the Soviets had developed long-range anti-aircraft missiles, capable of intercepting and shooting down targets at enormous altitudes of 25,000 meters. But in 1960 it was put to successful use, when an S-75 V-0 shot down a Lockheed U-2 aircraft while on a spy flight. Producing such a high-cost aircraft as the Valkyrie was no longer profitable, and the project was cancelled. North American Aviation attempted to continue manufacturing the aircraft, but for civilian use, although these experiments resulted in tragedy. On June 8, 1966, the XB-70 No. 2 made a flight with a military escort, with the aim of being photographed for an advertisement for General Electric, the manufacturers of the engines. One of the escorts, an F-104, performed a maneuver by mistake, hitting one of the wings of the Valkyrie, which suffered a huge momentary loss of stability, and ended up crashing in the mountains of Barstow, California. The pilot of the F-104 and the co-pilot of the XB-70 were killed, while the pilot of the latter managed to survive. The dream of the fastest American bomber in history lives on in a Valkyrie that was never put into service, but represents part of the history of the Cold War, exhibited at the Air Force Museum. Thank you very much for joining us until the end. Stay tuned for our next video.